I weep for the liberty of my country when I see at this early day of a successful experiment that corruption has been imputed to many members of the House of Representatives and the rights of the people have been bartered for promises of office. Andrew Jackson was the 7th President of the United States. It was still early days in the history of the United States. In Europe, we have just closed the 7th legislature of the European Parliament. It's still early days in this modestly successful European experiment. But as Parliament and the Commission grow in authority, many see the rise of vested interests, powerful lobbies, big business, and even foreign governments. Lobbying is a normal and necessary part of democracy. Even those who argue against the influence of lobbyists are themselves a type of lobbyist. Public concern about lobbying isn't so much to do with access, but transparency.
Lobbying is not a dirty word. It's good governance to talk to everybody, to create the best possible legislation. But of course, just because we talk to somebody doesn't mean they get what they want. The problem is inappropriate behaviour by lobbyists. And the answer to that is a maximum of transparency. And we have a whole range of measures to maximise transparency. We have the Transparency Register for lobbyists.
The Transparency Register in the Parliament, is it sufficient at the moment?
It's a good start, but it's voluntary, so we need to make it mandatory so that black sheeps, which those who don't register are basically forced to be registered.
It's not mandatory to be in, so if they're not in, that is not in itself a problem, although we would very much encourage them to be in, and we would even confront them and ask why they're not in. For an organisation that is in the register, if it does break the code of conduct, then we have a range of sanctions against them, up to and including ejecting them from the register. Which is actually a very serious move, especially for professional interest representative organisations, because for them, their reputation is everything.
Unfortunately, the current sanction for not being in the voluntary lobby register is that you're ejected from the register. So a voluntary register which ejects people is never going to work. So we need to make sure, if you're not in the register, that you're not allowed to meet with the Commission, you're not allowed access to the Parliament, and you're not allowed to sit in things such as expert groups.
No MEP, no assistant, no civil servant, no commissioner should ever meet a lobbyist which is not in the lobby register.
What are the obstacles to implementing that?
Lobbying by those lobbyists who don't want to be in the lobby register.
If an MEP, who's also a lawyer, earns more than €500,000 in 1 year, is it unfair to ask who paid that money? Is it unfair to ask for more information to ensure there's no conflict of interest? In February this year, Friends of the Earth Europe and the lobby watchdog Corporate Europe Observatory sent a letter to the office of the President of the European Parliament requesting an investigation to clarify potential conflict of interest relating to Rachida Dati, MEP. As you can see here, Rachida Dati, a talented French politician and a former Minister of Justice in the government of Nicolas Sarkozy, declared that she earned hundreds of thousands of euros as a lawyer in the year preceding her declaration of financial interest.
It's one of those examples of MEPs whose declarations of interest we found was not completely accurate or complete.
There is, let's say, good enough indications that Mrs. Dati received money for secondary jobs, so outside her job as an MEP. It seems to be not a small amount. This money is traced back to a certain French big energy company.
What we did was to write to the MEP to ask her to clarify what exactly was the nature of her law activities, and also if she was really a consultant for GDF Suez, and if that was the case, to declare this activity. We never got an answer.
We have in the Parliament a code of conduct. Mrs. Dati was in front of that code of conduct committee, and again she hid it like lawyers do behind the secrecies.
Here's the problem our democracy faces. Often it's simply not possible to follow the money. The rules don't compel a lot of detail when European deputies declare their income, and if you happen to be a lawyer, you can usually hide behind a right to attorney-client privilege. You don't have to say who your clients are, so it's impossible to see if an MEP who's also paid as a lawyer is likely to be representing the interests of their clients when they speak in Parliament, or when they make amendments to legislation. This ambiguous rule protecting lawyers from declaration is clearly against the spirit and the detail of Parliament's own code of conduct.
What we did was also to write to the President Schulz, telling him that he's responsible for the implementation of the code of conduct and asking him to basically play his role and ask the MEP to clarify what were really side interests. So far, he hasn't done anything. We haven't received any reply to our letter.
This is in February. They still haven't received our response from the presidency. Is that something you find acceptable?
No, and I think that Mr. Schulz is not doing good to himself and not doing good to a president of the European Parliament, not doing good for this institution. We need to take this case seriously, and I hope that the new president of the Parliament, be it Mr. Schulz or somebody else, will act on this case.
A spokesman for the Office of the President of the European Parliament told us they did receive a letter, but that no further action was taken by the President in the case of Ms. Daddy following advice of the Advisory Committee. When we asked for a copy of the advice which the President received, we were told the advice was given orally. Rather than rely on a second-hand account of what Ms. Daddy may or may not have said, we asked Ms. Daddy's office for a clear statement on whether she had worked for GDF Suez in her capacity as a lawyer, a role she is perfectly entitled to undertake. Ms. Daddy's office replied, Rashida Daddy has already answered very clearly these false and defamatory accusations. Rashida Daddy's lawyer has clearly stated that anyone who will continue spreading such false accusations will be brought to court. She has for some time now been the victim of various personal and racist attacks. These accusations come in this context. Wouldn't it be easier just to say, no, I didn't work for GDF Suez as a lawyer during my tenure as an MEP? Ms. Daddy has complied with the rules of declaration as they've been interpreted by the President of the European Parliament. The problem is not with Ms. Daddy, it is with the rules. Whether Ms. Daddy has worked for a client as a lawyer and then spoken in Parliament in a way which could be construed as a conflict of interest, we simply do not know.
I think Mrs. Dati should basically prove that she didn't receive money which served for lobbying, and it's very easy. She just has to give us access to the names of her clients. It's
a bit unclear what will happen now because of course the presidency is changing, but we will take the issue up again with the new president, and I think in general we will ask for a review of the code of conduct, for systematic screening of the declarations of interest, because this is just one of the many examples.
I hope that this parliament will finally bring more light in this case so that we can judge if Mrs. Dati is right when she says what I did is not in breach with the code of conduct of members of parliament, or if others are right to say Mrs. Dati is a typical case of a lawyer which makes abuse of the lawyer's secrecy to hide very dirty lobby activities.
The issue is not so much to accuse the MEP of anything, but making sure that actually the code of conduct works and that it allows for proper transparency and also allows to screen and detect potential conflicts of interest.
The issue is not to do with commitment or balance, the issue is transparency. The question is, who is paying and what are they paying for? Is there a conflict of interest?
A conflict of interest, it's described as something that would influence an MEP's position when he or she votes or draws up reports. They can turn to this advisory committee or to the president. In the end, it's always the president of the parliament, and they need to say, look, I cannot vote on this, I cannot work on this because I have a conflict of interest.
How is a process begun against the commissioner?
It might be Olaf, so the source can be from the outside or an Olaf investigation. It would then go to the College of Commissioners, who would collectively decide to put one of its members to the Court of Justice.
There's several sanctions possible, and they range from a reprimand to a financial sanction, in that up to 10 days of the daily allowances can be withheld, which is more or less 3,000 euros, to the suspension from an office that a member may hold.
The possible sanctions range from a warning, a caution, which is not even disciplinary, to a dismissal, and in very severe cases, we can also reduce the pension rights of the person concerned.
So the fact that they've left the organisation does not mean that our rules and our expectations don't have any teeth anymore. They have teeth and we're prepared to use them.
The worst case scenario can be a reprimand or can be a suspension of their daily allowance, but it cannot be, for instance, that you're deprived from your right to vote in plenary. So in the end, there's not a really big incentive to follow the code of conduct.
If we're going to have serious enforcement of ethics rules, then the Parliament needs a lot more resources to do so. The current department that's supposed to be implementing the code of conduct, the Secretariat, is hugely underfunded, and this is something that we can never expect to see MEPs following the rules or the rules being enforced if we don't give the funds necessary.
The consequences all depend on the President himself. The President has the power to decide to take action or not. So in some cases he can just say, I'm not going to do anything.
This kind of grey zone of political activity around lobbying is not something which should be tolerated. We need to implement our rules.
If these legislations, policies are going to affect us as citizens, then we have a right to know who's trying to influence them and who's having a say and whose opinion is being listened to. We need to know who's negotiating, on whose behalf, and whose interests are really being put forward.
We are not saying MEPs should not have any relationship with the outside world, but what we're saying is while they are in office, it is very clear that they should not be engaged in a side activity that brings them money while they are regulating the same sector. It should just be as simple as this.
If we know who is trying to shape policy decisions, if we know who lobbyists are meeting and what they're trying to achieve, then we can better measure the impact of lobby influence. This is important because the democratic process should be about fair representation, not about cash. It shouldn't be a case of pay to play. It was the pay-to-play scenario which Andrew Jackson was so fearful of, not because it led to good or bad policies, but because it undermined democracy. Look, we know we screwed up when we were in the majority. We fell in love with power, we spent way too much money, especially on earmarks. There was too much corruption when we ran this place. We were guilty, and that's why we lost.